done with immigration. We're not done, but we're done discussing immigration for a while. And we are on the Transcontinental Railroad, which I suppose could be immigration too, just on a railroad. The time frame we're talking about, Stevens Townsend Murphy was 1844. Donner Party was 1846, 1847. And we are now basically the nuts and bolts and the center of all this is in the middle of the 1860s. The thought about it starts in the 1850s, but we're going to focus on the 1860s when they get there. If the class wants to get together and buy me a present because I'm a swell guy, you really got to buy me this. I would love to put this in my backyard. It would just be people. There's a sidewalk behind my backyard. People would love to see this. I'd be kicked out of the homeowners association, but what a sculpture. This guy's name is Shui Jin Wang. That's the sculptor on the right. And this is the Chinese Railroad Workers Memorial. It is now housed in the Railroad Museum, which used to be open, and I think hopefully will be in a while. But you know, I remember going to Italy and they talked about how Da Vinci knew so much about the human body. Boy, this guy did a job on the muscles and everything else. Just amazing stuff. That's just a great picture, a great sculpture. And this is obviously a guy. Let's see, he's got this thing over here. This is probably a guy doing a tunnel because he's got the drill bolt there. Anyway, this is supposed to go up in Gold Run. There's a monument up there, a plaque to the Chinese railroad workers. But there seems to be some discussion now where it's going to go. I don't know, but it may go there, it may go someplace else. But anyway, well worth seeing. And again, we can raise about $1 bazillion we put in my backyard. Okay, for today's class. And for those of you who are as gullible as me, don't raise any money for this, okay? I was just kidding. The story goes on. Then we're going to talk about afterward a little bit, where we come. We'll do an incredibly brief history of the idea of a railroad. This is not the history of the railroad class. It's just the history of the railroad on Donner Pass class. Theodore Judah, Roots Over the Sierra, the Big Four, Dr. Daniel Strong, kind of a mystery man. Came across him when I was doing research. The Chinese and the railroad, who are kind of mysterious. They shouldn't be, but they kind of are less recently. Where'd they go and what can we see? And we can see lots of stuff because vegetation cannot grow over the Transcontinental Railroad. So it is still there. It is still there. Okay, from last week, 2 questions were asked. I think Eileen asked one. I think it was Eileen. If not, whoever did it, I appreciate the question. And she asked about the Mormon route, the Mormon immigrant route. And that's what this is, a road now. And I want to show this. This is where it is. You can see where it comes from. It's way up here, east of Lake Tahoe, comes all the way around, and the route becomes a road eventually. To put this in perspective of what's going on, and you can see the dates of these routes: 1848 for the Mormon route, 1860s for the Amador and Nevada wagon route. We're up here, right above where it says from last week. You can see the Rubicon River, where the horse party of the Stevens Townsend Murphy went. And there was no passes then, but Donner. There was nothing here. And as I said last week, sometimes I think the name of this class ought to be, I Feel the Need for Speed. Well, anything to make it faster. And so in the 1850s, the Johnson's cutoff started. The Carson route is over here, kind of down the Carson River. You can see all these different routes, and these routes all became roads. The Big T's route, pretty close to, a lot of it was on Highway 4. The Amador Nevada wagon route, you're probably looking at Highway 88. The Mormon route became the Mormon Immigrant Trail. You've got Highway 50 here, and you got, 50 and 89's out here someplace too. So you can see what happens. Donner Pass has some bad PR, I would say, and Donner Pass is hard, so people find different routes. So this is in the early 1850s, all this was starting. Okay, so there were other routes, and there were more routes. The name of the game was make it faster. Now, someone last week asked the intelligent question that I didn't know the answer to, and I should have. When did both the Stevens Murphy party and the Donner party arrive at Truckee Lake? And it was not hard to find out. It took me about 2 minutes. Donner's got there on or about 11/1/1846, and the Stevens Townsend Murphy party got there 11/15/44. So to reinforce the idea of luck, these are the smart guys, right? They were 2 weeks after them. and they made it and had 2 people added. These guys were 2 weeks early relative to the Stevens Townsend Murphy party and had half the party die. So it's kind of like when your number's up, your number's up. So that takes care of last week. Anybody has any questions at the beginning of today? I would be more than happy to look them up. And hopefully the people that asked them are here. Okay, we're gonna do a poll. And this is a poll because you guys are smart. There's right and wrong answers to this one. So Lori's gonna put this out and we're gonna see how smart this crowd is. And by the end of the class, you should know all the answers. Okay, first one, which person doesn't belong on this list? 2, which of the following can you not see in person? And we got Theodore Judah had nothing to do with, and which statement is true? So you could do those 4. And we are told in PowerPoint class to give the group 2 minutes on the poll, no more. And dead air is the enemy of all things PowerPoint. So I'm going to talk for the next 1 minute and 40 or 22 seconds and entertain people. So as I said, this group of questions, these are real people and these are real questions. And Lori was generous to you guys and added no idea. She's nicer than I am. But anyway, take your best shot at this. This is not going your permanent record, and it will not blow your scholarship for the next semester of Renaissance. Okay, so I'll be quiet now, no matter what they tell us to do. This one must be hard, Lori. We're getting no answers.
No, we're up to 12. There's actually 5 questions.
There are 5?
Yeah.
That's right. I embedded them. I should know that, huh? Oh yeah, which statement is true? That's right.
Yeah, so it looks like the answers are right up 38% right now. Be interesting to see which what the answers are, because we have people all over the place.
I know, and I know the answers, and wow. Wow. Well,
so maybe we wrap it up in 10.
Yeah, we're done.
9, 8, 7, 6.
Come on, guys, make a move.
Box in the middle of the picture.
4, 3.
What's in the
2,
picture?
1. All right.
Black box.
Yeah, it is. The gray box appears whenever Bill has something on his screen. So it is his poll. So he'll remove that when he goes back to the PowerPoint.
Okay, so the choice of the first one was which person does not belong in this list? The choice with the group overwhelmingly was Lincoln. That's wrong. This is great. I love this. You'll find the class, the answers we go on. Which of the following can you not see in person? That's amazing. You got that one right. We'll see. Theodore Judah had nothing to do with. The answer, by the way, is Bennetville, California. Okay. And which statement is true? That's pretty good. You got the answer right. Theodore Judah died before any track was laid. And number 5, which statement is true? Repealed, actually passed. Got that one right too. This is a smart class. Okay. Let's stop sharing results and get out of here. Okay. Is my screen cleared up now? I hope.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Hang on. Okay, afterward, let's talk a little bit about what happened after the Donner Party disaster in our case, so like 15 years ago or so from when we're going to start talking about railroad stuff. First of all, and this is 1880, remember the big rock, the breeding cabin was laid up against it. You can see what happened. It does not exactly become a tourist magnet. It just fell apart. So there used to be a cabin next to that. I'm sure that was burned. The idea was they also buried some body parts at the base of that rock. They never found much. So this was just kind of let to rot. There was nobody paying attention. They didn't have second houses up there or anything yet. And that's funny, the railroad was then going in 1880. So you think something might have taken place. Okay, and this guy is me. This looks up at 1956. I know I recognize the cool cuffs on the jeans. It's a Boy Scout guy, and those stumps from the winter of 1846. And I think, Ron, I think you told me once that there's some rumor in the back warehouse someplace at Donner State Park, they have some of these stumps still there, or cut down trees still there. So interesting to see if they ever come out. Okay.
They have two of them, and they're going to be putting them in the visitor center soon.
Absolutely. Okay. As well they should. That's good stuff. That's creepy stuff too. There's a great book called Tale of the Elephant by a lady named Olivia Newell. She has quotes by all the people that came across Donner Pass, immigrated across Donner Pass. And I don't read them all. You can spend days doing this. 2 log cabins. This is what they saw. Somebody came by in 1849 because the road went right past the campsite where the Donners were. 2 log cabins, bones of human beings and animals, the tops of trees being cut off at the depth of the snow was all that was left to tell the tale of the ill-fated, their sufferings and sorrow. So basically this stuff just sat there. And the idea that the military came by and cleaned it all up, guess not. I guess not. I don't know why it's going there. So afterward, some questions people ask, and a couple of quotes. Question number 1, why did the party not go back to Truckee Meadows? In other words, why didn't they just turn around and go back down to Reno? You recall the Reno area. The Indians, Native Americans, they didn't live up at Donner Pass all winter. They went back to Truckee Meadows because there's the snow so much there, not even hardly at all, and there's water and everything else. Why didn't they go back? Nobody knows. Nobody ever said anything. The only thing I'd ever come across was they sort of surmised that their focus was west, and they just were going to go west. They also, because they are from back east, the snow back east commonly melts between snowstorms. And I suspect there is some suspicion they figured it was just going to melt and they would keep going. And by the time they figured it out, the storms keep coming and coming. They were stuck. They were stuck. So that's the theory. Okay. What happened to the campsites after the winter? They just disintegrated. And you can tell they're starting to see them in 1849 on these quotes. They just kind of went away. I suspect we see one of the quotes here. People were picking them. And you'll see in a second. If you notice, this thing at 5 p.m. arrived at what is called Cannibal Camp. Some of the cabins are still to be seen, one of which I visited and found the remains of clothing, shoes, female apparel, and etc. I saw the lower part of one skull from which I got a tooth. And there's a charming person. And I suspect that person was not the only one, not the only one. This one also talks about bones are around, although most of them have been buried. So it was obvious they tried to bury some. And they did talk about pass by the Donner cabins in a valley. Up this valley is Truckee's Lake where the old road went. But they turned to the left. They went to a new route, which we're going to get to in a little bit. The Donners, believe it or not, didn't go, they were not supposed to go over Donner Pass. You don't hear much about that, but they were not. And we'll get to that a little bit later too. And finally, the third question, did any of the party members go back to the lake after the winter of 1846-47? I know Billy Graves, member of the Graves party, he went back afterwards to see, I don't know if he can get to see what was left of his family stuff. Some of the Donner kids went back way later when the state park was dedicated. Some of the Reed kids went back when they were old ladies at that point. If you think about, I was thinking about this question, and most of the adults are dead. So the kids aren't going to go back necessarily. So I suspect some probably went back to see what they could get, but I don't think it was a place you wanted to go to relive old memories or take pictures for your scrapbook. It just must have been grim. I wonder about the people who went. What a place to go back to. Anyway, okay, I talked a second ago about new passes. Donner Pass, if you recall, I showed you the number of immigrants coming across the Sierra. After the Donners, they kind of put a kibosh on the immigration, or should put a damper in it on the immigration movement for a while. And again, after 46, 47, you didn't really want to go to Donner Pass. It's creepy. You saw the quotes there, ugly and everything else. So they found 2 new passes, both easier than Donner Pass, Coldstream and Roller. Coldstream is this one right here. Donner's here. This is the far side of Donner Pass from the west. And this is Summit Valley up here. Donner Pass would have been right here. And the route is you come across, come down that hill, come right, Immigrant Trail is right over there. And you go off to the right. They dumped that one for the most part. Coldstream is right here. Roller was the first one. Roller's way over here. You basically take Coldstream Canyon. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit and come around. Roller was hard the last 100 yards or so, but it's much easier to get to. And once you're over, you just go down the other side right here. So these things became used. Roller the most in the late 1840s and early 1850s, Coldstream to a degree. And they're both still there. I'm still looking for those actually. And again, so he talks about immigrants also used Donner Pass and Johnson's Cutoff. That had just started in the early 1850s. And the interesting question, the interesting statement is Donner Pass was mainly avoided and forgotten about. But some people began to get ideas. There's always somebody with an idea, and history gets forgotten or ignored. So somebody started thinking about railroads. And Theodore Judah was the guy who started thinking about railroads. I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but he really started thinking about railroads. And we'll get to him in a second. So we'll talk about Judah, Strong, Lincoln on the railroads, and the Big Four. And again, this was an interesting picture. This Courier and Ives. I assume this was a card. I think Courier and Ives makes like Christmas cards and stuff. I'm not quite sure where in the Truckee River this is, but they used to invent things. So that was an early picture from 1871. Okay, Theodore Judah, railroad engineer, very successful back east, smart guy, nice guy, moral guy. Probably came to the wrong place at the wrong time. Anyway, he came to California in 1852 to work on the Sacramento Northern Railway. And if you ever ride Sacramento RT, you are on Theodore Judah's route. Much of that route he mapped out. So from the Sacramento to Folsom, I would assume. So that's his route. It's still going. I have a daughter that works in the planning department for City of Sacramento, and she told me cities never give up railroad routes and airports. Once you get an airport, once you get a railroad route, you never give it up without a fight because you can't get them back. So that's why it was probably still there. So he long envisioned a transcontinental railroad. He was talking about it for years. They thought he was nuts. Okay, and he made the initial proposal for a transcontinental railroad, and that was early in the 1850s. And Stephen Ambrose, who wrote the book "Nothing Like It in the World," great book about the Transcontinental Railroad. He said only nincompoops called him Crazy Judah. He was crazy like a fox. He was a talented guy, knew what he was doing. And this is his monument. This is in Old Town Sacramento. And if you're familiar with where this is, it's really, Theodore didn't get prime real estate in Old Town Sacramento. To his right is a subway. Behind him is the freeway. And I can't remember what's to the left, but it's not exactly what you call prime real estate for a guy who did what he did. Interesting monument. He's got the tunnels up here. This is the railroad tunnels up here. There's a lot of interesting frieze up here that he did that was done for him. Anyway, nice guy. Was a nice guy. I think maybe that was his problem. We shall see. This is the mystery guy, and I don't think I'm saying mystery because there's something weird about him or it was creepy. He just sort of came out of nowhere. He lived in Dutch Flat, which you can imagine is nowhere. There's a picture of Dutch Flat to the right. You can see all the hydraulic mining evidence of this. So it's a big mining town. Hydraulics, one of the first places it just got destroyed by the hydraulic mining. It's also destroyed over here. You can see it's down here too. Anyway, he was one of the initial investors. He and Judah wrote up the initial articles of association for the railroad. He showed Judah the abandoned wagon route for the railroad. I think we'll get to that in a second, but what he basically did was he knew Judah was looking around. He was interested in railroad. He said, hey, I got this old route nobody uses anymore. And it was Donner Pass. And so he's the guy that showed him Donner Pass. And then, so he became part of it. He was on this Central Pacific Railroad Board of Directors in 1863. And then he resigned, which we'll get to why in a bit. But he was a famous guy, important guy. His options of railroad routes. Somebody asked why Donner Pass. And I came to a simple way of putting it the other night. I was badgering my wife about this and making her fall asleep as I explained various points I wanted to get across. He had 5 choices. And I came to it when I was talking to her. He had Folsom, Greenwood, and Georgetown, which is number 1 down here. So this is more of the most southerly route. And this would be go around the edge of Tahoe. One of the problems with this one is you got the summit to get into Tahoe, and then you got another one to get out. So a lot of these things have 2 summits. a lot of these routes. Then you got Auburn, Illinois Town, Dutch Flat, and Donner Pass. If I were giving extra credit, I would ask the question, because this class will get it. Where's Illinois Town? Illinois Town is actually Colfax. So they named it after the Speaker of the House of Representatives, I think that's what he was, came to visit and see the railroad, and then became the vice president at one point. And they changed the name from Illinois Town to Colfax. And then they went to Dutch Flat and then went over Donner Pass. And that would be this one. This one only has one summit, which is one of the big advantages. Then we had Nevada City, Pennis Pass, which is Dog Valley. Dog Valley becomes famous in about, well, actually now it becomes really famous in about 50 years. And then you go down, we're getting north here, Downeyville, Yuba Gap, way up here. And then finally Oroville, Bidwell's Bar, the middle fork of the Feather River, and then Beckworth Pass. This is the UP now, UP route now. They use this one too. And Donald was the choice. And why? I had a brilliant explanation last semester. It was just creative and everything else. And I realized the answer is because it was the easiest. That's always the answer, because it was the easiest. And we'll see in a little bit how they made Donner Pass even easier as they go on. They redo them to make them easier and to make them faster and to have more people get through. So yeah, because it was easy. So specifically speaking, why Donner? First of all, remember the long, mostly straight grades on the western side? Well, that was where they had most of them. They were interrupted by creek rivers, so they had to make trestles, but by and large, they were pretty flat, reasonably flat, gradual, and they were long and straight. Snow, this is a quote from Judah, a railroad line upon this route can be kept open the entire year. Ted kind of had that one wrong, which we'll get to in a second. 15 tunnels they had to dig, and that strikes me as a lot, but that was fewer than any of the other routes. And finally, back to the summits, only one. Other routes had 2. So basically it comes out because it's easier and more efficient. Now, speaking of snow, this is from 1952, and this is the city of San Francisco trying to redo the Donner Party.
Northern California digs out after the worst series of blizzards in 50 years. Roaring in from the Pacific, the storms have blanketed the countryside and halted all movement. Sometimes you have to dig for 10 feet to reach the roof of a car. With buildings nearly buried, the mailman's work becomes strenuous. Along one highway, a snow depth of almost 20 feet is measured. Below, almost hidden in the snow, lies the crack express train city of San Francisco, which stalled at Donner Pass, some 7,000 feet up in the high Sierras, while en route from Chicago to San Francisco. In Colfax, 34 miles away, nurses and other rescue workers board a relief train to go to the aid of the 222 passengers and crew members marooned on the snowbound streamliner. These scenes give an idea of the depth of the snow. The relief train finds the going tougher as it chugs higher in spite of a rotary plow in front to clear a way. Donner Pass got its name, by the way, from a party of pioneers who were stopped here 100 years ago by blizzards. There were no diesel trains to come to their rescue, and many perished from cold and starvation. Though nature has run wild here, snows are necessary, for they provide waters that irrigate California's farmland. 6 miles from the streamliner, heavy drifts force the relief train, whose forward section can be seen ahead, to stop. Provisions for the beleaguered passengers are loaded on Army weasels, which, because of their caterpillar tread, can get across the snow to the stalled city of San Francisco. The weasel is an amphibious vehicle developed during the war and since found to have a variety of peacetime uses. Here is the city of San Francisco, hopelessly blocked by snowdrifts, its sides festooned with icicles. It's been here 3 days with the passengers aboard. A news magazine cameraman is the first newsreel man there. For the last 2 days, the passengers have gone without heat. 60 were overcome by gas fumes and are taken off on sled stretchers, but none suffered serious injuries, and they report that spirits were cheerful on the snowbound train. Then the monumental task of digging out the streamliner begins. Passengers are on their way home, but for 2 more days, the train lies embedded in its prison of snow. Now she moves. She's on her way. Man has won this particular skirmish in the unending battle with the forces of nature.
Hold on. Back to that guy for, oops. Anyway, that was 1952. I believe he was wrong. It was not on Donner Pass. I believe it was closer to, when they said 34 miles from Colfax, I believe that's closer to Yuba Gap and Immigrant Gap, I believe. Anyway, wherever it was, I love how they said the morale was good. I'll bet you that place smelled. And those people got real tired of being cold, and the toilets plugged up, and it must have been a scene. And I'm sure there were more than a few Donner Party jokes when they started. And by the end, they weren't jokes anymore. They weren't jokes. So that's a whole, I'm glad I wasn't there. Why you think you might want to do it, and you think you wouldn't. Okay. Okay, to the big four. We got finished with Judah for a second. I love these. Every so often you get a great quote. Charles Crocker, none of us knew anything about railroad building. From that guy, Charles Crocker had no ego problems. It was interesting what he would say that. To zip through these guys briefly to start, all storekeepers, and I think they had bigger ideas than being a storekeeper. He was the governor of Leland Stanford, governor of California. He's got his mansion in downtown Sacramento. Ended up at Stanford University, which we'll talk about later. Collis Huntington Beach, that guy. He came to California by ship, I believe, over through Panama. He didn't like it, and he wanted to start a store. You know, one of the biggest, I kept hearing over and over again, one of the biggest ways to make money, or a big way to make money in this railroad, was to have the franchise of shovels. Think how many shovels they must have had. Anyway, Charlie Crocker, another storekeeper, he was a construction boss. I want somebody to do something, I'm calling Charlie Crocker. He may kill people to do it, but I'm calling Charlie Crocker, I'm calling him. He thought the prairie was too slow, covered wagons were too slow. And then Mark Hopkins, and he was Huntington's friend, Collis Huntington's friend, and he became the treasurer of the railroad. And this became the big four. And they became known as robber barons. So when you're a robber baron, you always look like this. You're not skinny, and you have swords, things like legislation and trusts and all this kind of stuff. And they're comparing them to what they were back in the Middle Ages. So the definition of a robber baron, and they're kind of funny because they're philanthropists too, but one of America's successful industrialists during the 19th century, which that doesn't make you a robber baron, but the part that does is a term that is also sometimes attributed to any successful businessman whose practices are considered unethical or unscrupulous. And the big four certainly got that, if you recall, to show how much they got it, if you went to school in California and you were in school in the late 60s, in your junior year, you took American history, and your English class would have been about American literature. And we read, where I went to school, The Octopus by Frank Norris. And The Octopus was about the railroad. He was a muckraker, and it was all about how the railroad was just brutal to everybody. So about the robber barons. So Frank Norris, I like that book because it's easy to read. I had a tough time reading some of that stuff. Okay, so the big four robber barons, probably so. Okay, now Judah versus the big four. Judah went to San Francisco. The name of the game with the railroad is financing, which we'll get to in a little bit. And what he did was he went to San Francisco where the money was to get people to invest, and nobody did, and nobody wanted to do it. So he didn't like that very much. So he decided to go back to Sacramento, which is where he basically hung out, and had a meeting and invited all the people in old Sacramento, all the stores and stuff and all the businesses. And three of these, I don't think Huntington showed up, but the other three did. And they should have had Jaws music playing when they were in there. The last thing this guy probably wanted, looking back on it, was these four guys to invest, because they became his undoing, okay? And the problem, I thought, as I read about this, the problem was basically as I describe it up here. Judah was an artist, and I put artist in quotation marks. He was all about art. His art was the thing. He didn't trust the big four. He shouldn't have. He wanted to make a Sacramento office building for the railroad building. So he drew up these plans, and they were lovely, and the building was lovely, and I'm sure. And then they didn't want to build it. If you look over here, they built it for $150. They threw together a wooden shack. They didn't want to screw around. So they forget your building, bud. We just want to get something done. When he died, he was going back east to get Cornelius Vanderbilt, the shipping magnate from back east, to buy the Big Four out. He didn't want to work with them anymore. Big Four, the opposite of the artist. It was get it done. Practicality. If you know what I mean, there's nothing wrong with artists. There's nothing wrong with being practical. But they do this a lot of times when they're in the same place, going to the same goal. So practicality to the nth degree, get it done. No screwing around. I don't want to be an artist. If I can make a building for 150 bucks, let's do it that way and not make this grandiose thing that'll be there 100 years from now and be in architectural magazines. See, the name of the game was build a railroad. Later, we're going to fix it. Okay. In the meantime, cut corners and make other people pay for it. There was some discussion in the books I read. They don't know how the railroad stood up. They were going so fast and trying to get it done so fast. And the idea was make it, and we'll go back and we'll fix it later. And the reason is because of money. Okay. And again, Ambrose had a great way of explaining it. Judah knew how stresses and strain worked on bridges, curved tracks, anything mechanical, but not how they worked on human beings. The Big Four want to build the railroad fast at the greatest possible profit to themselves. He wanted to build it well. And there is the dichotomy that you're not going to fix. They got it done their way, and he was squeezed out. And he was squeezed out. If you did this picture in terms of, okay, relative importance, he should be about at the end of it, he was squashed by elephants. He was squashed by the elephants. Okay, now I asked you guys a question, and maybe somebody answered it. What do Hagen Oaks Golf Course, cross-country running, and $48,000 have to do with the Transcontinental Railroad? I don't suppose anybody wants to answer that, do they? If you do, raise your hand and tell Lori. Otherwise, I'll give you the answer if you don't know what it is. Any golfers out there? If you're a golfer, you might see it.
I'm not seeing any hands come up.
I'm killing the crowd, Lori. Okay, well, we'll just keep plugging then. This is weird talking to the wall here. Basically, if you look on the right where it says financing a railroad, the numbers you want to hear are 16,000, 32,000, and 48,000. The federal government reimbursed the railroad for miles on the flats, which would be on the way to the Sierra in Sacramento, from Sacramento to the Sierra. They got $16,000 a mile reimbursed. $32,000 was paid in the plateau, which they defined as between the Sierra and Utah, where the railroads, where the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific met. Don't forget they were trying to meet in the middle somewhere. So you got 32,000 bucks a mile for that, and you got 48,000 bucks in the High Sierra, and 48,000 bucks is what they wanted. So the railroad sent out Josiah Whitney. Think of Mount Whitney. So he was a state geologist. He came out to determine where the Sierra started. And he determined the Sierra started on the banks of Arcade Creek, which is on this golf course. So you can see the hills here. That certainly is the Sierra, I suspect. So they decided that the Sierra would start on Arcade Creek. They had to take it back to Lincoln, because Lincoln was involved in he was a railroad lawyer, and he was pushing the railroad for years. So they went back to Lincoln. He said, sounds good to me, basically. And then that's when they started getting 48,000 bucks from the banks of Arcade Creek. And they went through Hagen Oaks Golf Course. And this is a bunch of cross-country runners, which they also do at Hagen Oaks Golf Course. So that's what it has to do, what has to do with it. The interesting thing is, you can take a train that goes from Sacramento to Reno. You know, the fun train? I think Lori said once she took the fun train. Well, there's the fun train and there's the history train. So I took the history train. Oddly enough, we followed the fun train. The fun train, you could see it from the history train, was having a heck of a time. They were having lots of fun. They were hanging out the back with the back door and stuff. It was like a lot of fun. Well, the history train was a little more sedate, but they have a narrator from the museum, the Railroad Museum. And as he went through this, we start off, and this was years and years ago. I wasn't too familiar with what was going on. He got to Arcade Creek and the part near Hagen Oaks, and he talked about, I was surprised how he did this. He talked about what I just talked about, 48,000 bucks a mile. When you get to the Sierra, Josiah Whitney, the state geologist, decided that that's where the Sierra started, and the railroad took the money and ran. And then he got really critical and started talking about one of the first, it wasn't the first, but one of the bigger examples of graft cheating, lying, thieving, and everything else that the government did. And I asked a friend of mine who worked for the museum, was that part of his, they have a script, but that was not part of his script. So that was, he threw that in. So I'm gonna take that again and see if they still say that, but you certainly can say that. So that's Hagen Oaks Golf Course on Highway 160. You can visit it. By the way, the 6,400 acres per mile, every other mile on alternate sides of the railroad, they were given 6,400 acres. Now, think how you can sell a lot of acres for 64, or you can sell a whole lot of farms and a whole lot of sections in 6,400 acres. So they made money there too. By the way, the railroad still owns a lot of the land out there. It's not gone, it's still there. Okay, so you got Judah making it, you got the Big Four getting money for it, and you got the guys who are gonna build it. And this is the Chinese and Charlie Crocker. Once again, he didn't keep his mouth shut. They built the Great Wall of China, didn't they? There was a whole lot of discussion about the China. They couldn't get people to work. The Irish people, which are my relatives, they didn't want to do that stuff at all. I wouldn't either. So they kind of basically took the train to get paid, worked on the railroad, and then went to Nevada to work in the mines there. So they weren't very good workers. Some of them stayed, but they weren't good. They went on strike and they caused problems. Okay, about the Chinese workers. I have tried like crazy to find out how big as human beings these gentlemen were. Couldn't find much anything. I got one historian who was seen to be sneered at by a lot of other historians, but she said the average person was 4 feet 10 inches tall. But it's not 4 inches 10 inches, 4 feet 10 inches tall, 120 pounds. I bet you there's nobody listening to me who's smaller than that. So 4 feet 10, 120 pounds, $35 a month, which was not bad wages. It was not as good as what the Irishmen got or what the non-Chinese got, but that was not bad wages at all. They guessed about 1,200 deaths. They don't even know. Nobody wrote it down. There are interesting ways to find out how many deaths. The railroad at the end, when it was done, and maybe periodically, would send back boxes with bones in them, back to China. The religion of these gentlemen was you want to be buried in where your home is. So they would send back the bones, and they sort of counted that way. Send back railroad cars full of bones in boxes. So they estimated 1,200 deaths. I saw one estimate done by the Central Pacific was 300 deaths, but that was a long time ago. And I'm sure they don't want to think anybody died. But there were instances of people getting blown up, landslides, snow slides, and so on. 10 to 12,000 workers. I've heard 10 to 15,000 workers, 10 to 20,000 workers, a lot. And they got them primarily from Guangdong province. It was 7,000 miles away. Took 2 months by sea, and they recruited from there. And if you wondered why they would come here, they would come for the same reason immigrants always come. Bad situation at home, wars, no jobs, starvation, on and on and on. And the idea is to come here, and you got a land of opportunity, so to speak. It's the same for every race, every ethnic group, every race that's ever come here. The reasons are always the same. And it took 2 months by sea. It took 6 months to come from the Mississippi Valley, interestingly enough. Got these two pictures, famous one, they're filling a ravine, cart by cart by cart. And if you look at this thing closely here, if I can do this, and I probably can't, it's just a horse and a cart. It might be two guys, and they just dump it. And these are filled in by shovels. I told you about the shovel franchise, and that's what they did, just cart by cart. They're coming this way and going back this way. And then this is a T carrier at Tunnel 8. This gentleman is, and people like him, were responsible for one of the reasons that the Chinese were so effective doing the railroad. They didn't get sick because they boiled their water. There was a story about the Union Pacific that the way they got the Irishmen to work really fast was they put whiskey at the end of the goal of the day. The Irishmen worked faster to get to the whiskey. The non-Chinese workers didn't take as good a care of themselves, got sick. These guys rarely got sick. They took care of themselves, they bathed and so on. And the boiled water, because they didn't know about water and germs and so on, helped their health quite a bit and make them longer workers or better workers. Now, to explain more about the Chinese, I thought an interesting way to do it would be to talk about the controversies here and explain the controversies. Controversy you can put in quotation marks. Nobody's wrestling about this. or writing dissertations. I might be writing dissertations. Historians and colleges do weird things sometimes. Anyway, semi-controversy number one. I'll call it a semi-controversy. This is Cape Horn. Cape Horn is it's a big point that came around above the American River. It's about 1,200 feet above the American River, and there's no place to put the railroad. They had to dig out basically a platform, a sidewalk is what they did. And there's two ways they said they did it. This is the classic way. This picture, by the way, was found in a closed Chinese restaurant on the wall, just there. The restaurant was closed and somebody came in and found it. You notice these guys hanging in baskets, and there's people up here with ropes. The ropes are hanging, they're holding the people up. And the job here would be drill a hole, put explosives in, and then get pulled up to the top while the fuse is going and before they blow up. And so that was one of the first things they said. This was sort of the myth. And if they didn't do it here on Cape Horn, I'll show you where you can see Cape Horn. You can decide for yourself if they did it. They did it someplace else in the baskets. And here's a little different interpretation, and probably the one that's more accepted now as far as Cape Horn goes, where they just kind of have harnesses, and it wasn't a straight drop. If you look at it, it's more like it goes off at an angle. Either way, this is hard. This is hard. These guys are getting blown up. I mean, it's not just like they go up and you go up and blow it up and keep moving. No, these guys would get blown up. And you see this guy right here is doing what they do. He has this big drill bit, and he turns it. This guy hits it. Imagine how many times that guy's hands got hit, and turns it a quarter turn every time he hits it, around and around and around. And that's how they made the holes to get the powder in. So it's called powder monkeys. Mian Satu is another artist. I was telling Laura I had one of his pictures after I finished the last class. I was given one. So I'll show you that in a minute. Anyway, so this is Cape Horn. Did they do it this way? Whether they did or not, they did it someplace. And it's a nasty job. It is a nasty job. A lot of guys died doing that. This is creepy. Okay, then you go to this one. This is called Catfish Lake. Above Donner Pass. This is not very far from Donner Pass itself. It's across from an actual railroad. The story is that the Chinese, because they demanded fresh food, the railroad sent them fresh food from San Francisco and Sacramento. That's another reason why they were healthy. They sent them fresh food. Fish would be a staple of the diet. Well, they wanted catfish. So apparently the story is, don't start this yet. The story is they planted this lake with catfish, and the catfish are still there. And I'll show you where the catfish are. Then I'll tell you what the new story is. Anyway, this is a guy named Mark McLaughlin. I got to cut. I want to see Mark talk for 3 minutes. I'll get you past that. Okay, this is Mark McLaughlin coming up to Catfish Lake, and he actually says some interesting things. He's feeding the catfish. He better speak.
Chinese catfish, first planted in late 1860s by Chinese cooks who thought Central Pacific Railroad was already bringing them fresh seafood, but sometimes I guess they didn't get the delivery, or it wasn't that good. And I guess that some of the cooks said, why don't you bring us some live catfish? We're going to be here building, carving out this tunnel for another couple of years. We'll plant the local pond, and if you ever don't have fish, fresh fish, we'll go up there and net some. And that's how this happened, because you don't find catfish indigenous to the 7,000-foot elevations of the High Sierra. I'm sorry, it just doesn't go that way, but look at, now we're getting there. See, now we're getting there. We're getting some activity. Here we go. These guys go crazy for this bread. Trying to blow up the mosquitoes, rip the bread, feed the catfish, do the video, and I guess we learned to multitask. Trying to get more into the sun so maybe we get a better view. Here's a big piece. Who's listening? We get a lunker for this one. It's funny, when I look in the monitor here, the viewfinder, I can't see anything. So I'm just hoping I'm getting in on this. back it up just in case. You can see these babies, I'm sure of it. Yeah, they're coming.
Okay, you guys get the idea. I think it's creepy, frankly, but anyway, nobody asked my opinion. And number 3, who was at Promontory Summit? If you know your history, Promontory Summit in 1869 was where the 2 railroads, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, joined. And the classic interpretation is when you look at this picture down here, even this picture up here, the Chinese were hardly ever there. There was no Chinese at all. That's why this picture is about 150th anniversary. It's full of Chinese folks, ancestors, no doubt. This picture was taken an hour before the ceremony. The Chinese guy right there, probably right there. And the Chinese guys actually did drive the spike in to put the last rail in because Leland Stanford missed. But they got the experts out there and they did it really quickly. Then they got the official picture. There's not a Chinese guy in sight, except maybe right here. Gordon Chang, who wrote one of the great books about this, talks about that guy. But the story is, where'd they go? They were told to go away. There's also no Irish workers there either. They got rid of them too. These are all people coming to see it, as my latest understanding of it is. So who was there? The Chinese were actually not there. They were told when the railroad was joined, they were sent back to start fixing stuff. So they're around, but they were sent back. Charlie Crocker had a luncheon for dignitaries after the Golden Spike was driven and invited a couple of the crew leaders in. And they came in and got a Chinese crew leaders came in and got a standing ovation. Probably a little puzzled, but they were praised to the heavens. The people that did the railroad and others too. It was not done. It was not done in anonymity. So they weren't there, but they were kind of around. So like most things, it's not quite what the actual, I don't know, public perspective, public persona or public perspective is. But they should have been driving the spike themselves and had a picture of them right here because they did the work. Believe me, they made the railroad. So who was there? They were sort of all there, but they should have been more there, I guess is the way to put it. And the way it should have been, Jan Situ, another artist. Anyway, this picture is interesting. Hardly any women were there. This is supposed to be Stanford because he's got the, I assume, because he's got the hammer. Otherwise, this is a bunch of guys. And in this case, Mian Situ put the workers in. And there's the workers' hats and so on. So he definitely put the workers in. So great artist, interesting stuff that he does. Now, this picture is here. It's 10 miles in one day. This is the one I was given. My wife purchased this for me. I still never ask her how much it cost, and I don't want to know. But this is 10 miles in one day. What they did was when there were less than 20 miles to go, they were having a race to see who could do the most tracks in one day. So they got everybody together, hundreds of workers. They had their best Irish workers, and they laid 10 miles of track in one day. And when they finished, I think there were only 3 miles to go anyway, so that Union Pacific couldn't do it again and beat them. So, and this is the group doing that. I believe this is probably Charlie Crocker, big guy, and you can see the Irish workers here and so on. So this is Mian's too. Almost not trying to rewrite history, to write it for the first time, like we were there. Okay, well, I can see, we're gonna watch this. Okay, this is, frankly, I think this is one of the reasons for this particular class. This is the Forest Service did this. Your federal government at work did this video, and it's long, it's 20 minutes long. I would never show this except because of what it is. I think you'll enjoy this, and after this, we'll take a 5-minute break. So it's called Legacy.
In 2010, my father passed away, and some family and business took me to China. I'm firstborn American Chinese on my dad's side of the family, and my wife and I both moved there to Hong Kong and Beijing, where we lived for almost 5 years. We really enjoyed our time, but it was time to move on. And so we moved back to Lake Tahoe. Pretty much 90% of my work is spent in the mountains here. It's interesting, you know, I moved here from China to pursue work, and being back here on Donner Summit where I've climbed and like knew a little bit about the history, whether it be the Donner Party or how the railroads were built by the Chinese here. And I'm like, oh, I'm not the first person to move here from China and try to make a living and a better life for myself.
In the years after the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion. As the railroad was making progress, there was one really formidable barrier, and that was the 7,000-foot summit of the Sierra Nevada mountains. To build a railroad across these mountains, the Central Pacific turned to an unlikely workforce, the Chinese.
The builders of the railroad realized they didn't have enough workers to do the thing. So they said, well, let's try the Chinese who are here mining or doing other things like this. And they started the crew right here in Auburn. They realized that the Chinese was such a great workforce that they decided to start recruiting Chinese to the point where you almost had up to, we don't know the exact numbers, but there could be 12 to 20,000 workers coming and made up 80 to 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce.
The location chosen to cross these mountains was Donner Pass on the present-day Tahoe National Forest.
There are 3 sites within the boundaries of the Tahoe National Forest related to the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad. These sites are all that remain and exemplify the incredible effort that it took to blast the railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains. China Wall was constructed by hand, block by block. It supported the original alignment of the Central Pacific Railroad. Summit Camp was a work camp. There were barracks, there were cookhouses, there were stables for horses. So it was definitely an area where there was a collection and a focus for work activities.
There were maybe 3,000 people at that camp that lived over there for over 2 years, building that tunnel in adjacent areas to the tunnel.
Construction of the Summit Tunnel was slow and laborious. Workers were only able to move 14 inches of rock a day. To blast through the granite, hand charges had to be set. Holes were drilled by hand using a drill and a sledgehammer. A charge was then set with black powder, and after the blast, a different crew would come in to remove the waste rock.
And it was through 2 of the worst snowstorms ever recorded in history. They were building this tunnel, which is 5 football fields long.
And I find that remarkable. That was 1866, 1867. Today it would be hard during summertime. To think about them doing that during the winter, I think is incredible.
This was the highest elevation tunnel ever built in the world at the time. They had to invent techniques to do this. And it was all done by hand. How could we do these things? It was really Chinese labor who changed America. American project, it was designed, it was directed by Americans, built with American capital, but the hands, the feet, the labor, the sweat, The grunting, the pain, the death, the accomplishments were all Chinese-oriented.
The story of the Summit Tunnel itself, that term should be as compelling or evocative to us as when we hear the words, the Trail of Tears, or the Underground Railroad, or the Oregon Trail, or Route 66. We need to tell that as part of our, and that's the collective our folklore.
In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is complete. Leland Stanford drove a gold spike into the last rail at Promontory Summit, Utah, and the nation cheered. The Transcontinental Railroad revolutionized trade. It united East and West. It opened up international markets from Asia all the way to Europe. And eventually it revolutionized the American economy, as well as the way that we travel. Here in my time, we have the internet that allows us to send email across the world or across the street in real time. These are analogous events, and they both changed how we live.
There's a chapter in American history that belongs to the Chinese, and that a lot of it has to do with the construction of the Transcontinental and how the Transcontinental Railroad transformed this country.
Following the completion of the railroad, this huge surplus Chinese workforce was no longer welcome. Pent-up discrimination and the introduction of more onerous laws and unfortunately common values that espoused hatred and prejudice caused many Chinese to return to China. It caused others to go off and do subtle work, but the drumbeat of discrimination and hatred towards Chinese people kept increasing, and that culminated in 1882 with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
So in 1882, Congress passed what might be called the first comprehensive immigration law, in which it excluded Chinese from immigrating to the United States, and then it prevented Chinese from becoming American citizens. It actually illustrates one of the tensions that occur throughout the American history from its beginning. Well, that tension has always been there. It's illustrated in the Chinese case that after we have built this railroad because we needed laborers, we bring in immigrants or people from another country. 14 years later, we then try to kick them all out.
Following the passage of the 1882 Act, the Chinese contribution to our country began to be forgotten or neglected, or maybe consciously excluded from our memory. By the early 20th century, not many people thought about this or even realized these things had happened. And in 1969, perhaps the biggest snub occurred at the centennial of the completion of the railroad.
A representative of the Historical Society was invited to be at that May 10th ceremony at Promontory. That individual was Phil Choi. So there was a lot of anticipation and a feeling that, aha, took 100 years, but we're finally gonna get our just recognition. He gets to the ceremony and then he's told, oh, we are sorry, Mr. Choi, but we have taken you off the program because the program just doesn't have enough time. But then he had to sit through the keynote speaker, who was then the Department of Transportation Secretary, John Volpe, who said, who else but Americans could drill 10 tunnels in mountains 30 feet deep in snow? Who else but Americans could chisel through miles of solid granite? The snub in 1969 inspired a number of people to try to make it right.
In 2011 and 2012, we got both the Senate and the House to agree to resolutions that talk about We actually put it into the official record then, the congressional record, the history of Chinese migration here, their contributions to the country, and the reactions which the United States had to them.
Another part of the
Are
effort
we on break?
the appropriate milestone or celebrations that our stories, the Chinese story, was covered, would be voiced.
The group's consensus was we couldn't just drop it. You had to form something that continued to tell the story.
Things began to change as the country neared the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike ceremony in 2019. This time, a lot of groups, including the U.S. Forest Service, the 1882 Foundation, the National Park Service, the Chinese Historic Society, and many other groups and individuals would work tirelessly to make sure that this time the story was told completely and accurately.
The U.S. Forest Service is proud to help tell this story. Working with these organizations, the U.S. Forest Service has jointly hosted the Return to Gold Mountain tours. The Return to Gold Mountain tour provides an opportunity for descendants of the Chinese railroad workers, educators, and members of the public to visit important Chinese cultural heritage sites within the boundary of the Tahoe
Should I
National
have
Forest.
a black screen?
So we are on a train from Reno to Sacramento as part of a historic tour. Shortly, I will be visiting both my paternal and maternal ancestral villages in the Pearl River Delta region in southern China. And as part of my preparation work, I started to talk to a great uncle, and then he revealed to me that I actually have ancestors that worked on the Transcontinental Railroad. So in many ways, I feel like my homecoming has begun.
The Forest Service is looking at opportunities to outreach to the urban, suburban populations, people that we might not normally connect with out on National Forest System lands. One way that we did this is going to the San Francisco Chinese New Year Festival, having a booth, bringing Smokey Bear, talking to kids, parents, families, any member of the public, telling them about the Return to Gold Mountain tour, opportunities to sign up, giving them information about our Explore APA Heritage website, and giving them a booklet so they can visit the sites on their own if they can't make the tour.
And that's contributed to the public interest in the public lands, because it's something that you don't normally think about Chinese and the forest or the outside.
The Chinese historical sites within the boundaries of the Tahoe National Forest are so important. Many people don't realize they're there. Many people don't realize that this is a way that they can get to our National Forest System land and do something besides what we might think of as a traditional recreational opportunity. Hiking, camping, skiing, fishing, that type of thing. You can also go learn about our history, and it's our nation's living history.
On the Tahoe National Forest and many other sites, there's a renewed interest in the cultural history and the other cultural sites connected with these great events. So now you could really see the momentum as this story began to spread thanks to these people's efforts. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad is a huge story, but thanks to the contribution of the Chinese workers originally and the renewed enthusiasm of the people wanting to perpetuate their memory, the Chinese story became the dominant narrative connected with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad.
We could not have asked for better media coverage of the 150th and the story of the Chinese. Everybody picked up on the themes that we felt were important.
One could argue that the culmination of all of these efforts was the 150th anniversary celebration at Promontory Summit, Utah. This time, the current Secretary of Transportation had something different to say.
Today, at the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike ceremony, marking the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, is a day to commemorate the contribution of railroads and the contribution and sacrifices of the railroad workers, including approximately 12,000 or more Chinese laborers, who risked everything to make the Transcontinental Railroad a reality. Building from the west the Central Pacific Railroad hired 15,000 workers, of which 12,000 or more were Chinese immigrants. These workers of Chinese ancestry blasted and chiseled their way through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains, using manual hammer drills, pickaxes, and explosive. They dug 15 tunnels through pure, hard granite. An estimated 500 to 1,000 Chinese workers lost their lives. But the Chinese workers persevered and played a key role in building one of the greatest infrastructure projects in the world.
I think we could be very happy that the story of the Chinese contribution to the Transcontinental Railroad was finally told in all its glory.
But you know what is really heartening during the 1882 project was, as unknown as it was to so many people, how many surprised it was how welcoming people said, tell me more. Tell me more about this story. I want to know more details. I want it in our textbooks. I want it in our public records and so forth. That is encouraging.
And we had an elected official or an appointed official, the Secretary of Transportation, speak on behalf of the country, acknowledging the contribution of Chinese workers. We couldn't have dreamt that in 1969.
That gives us hope for the creation or continuation of what it is that should be American, who are Americans, what that means, not just for my grandkids or to acknowledge the fact that my grandfather and great-grandfather, they were important in building this nation, but it's also for everyone else who is an American trying to become part of this American nation.
I'm so lucky that I get to even play here at all, and I hit the lottery that I've been able to make it a living working and playing in the places that I love. Those feelings and those opportunities wouldn't have been available if it wasn't for the people that came before me, like my father and the immigrants that originally came here from China as laborers to build our infrastructure, such as these railroads here in Donner Summit.
I think for me, I didn't really get a sense of the impact of my connection to this particular site until I walked through Summit Tunnel and then seeing that maybe this particular granite that I'm touching right now could be the same granite that my great-great-grandfather had touched.
The original immigrants, they created a legacy of coming here to the United States to pursue a better life. And I'm proud to be a part of that legacy.
Okay, guys, 5 minutes from here. Lori, 5 minutes. 1:16.
Okay.
Right, let me get rid of this thing too. Yeah, I'm gonna start, Lori.
We're started now, yes.
Okay, thank you for coming back. Really like that video. I've seen it like 4 times now, and boy, my daughter saw it. She lives back east, and she said, "You know, Dad, they ought to make a monument to those guys." I said, "Well, they did." But heck of an achievement. Interesting. Just a great video. Okay, I can see people now, by the way, so it's a whole new world over here. Let's see if we can finish up in a reasonable amount of time. Where did they go? Theodore Judah died in New York. He did never see a rail laid. He saw preparatory work, but never saw a rail. He died, you can read it, 8 months after construction began. He died of yellow fever He got in Panama on the way to New York, and he was on in the way to New York to convince Cornelius Vanderbilt to return with him to California about the Big Four. Judah had enough. He didn't like where the Sierra started. He didn't like the way their construction policies, tactics, and so on. Just did not get along with those guys. Daniel Strong, a Dutch Flat resident. It's hard to imagine anybody being a Dutch Flat resident, sort of the middle of nowhere out there, but he was a druggist. And he was one of the guys, as we said before, who sort of refound Donner Pass. And he was an ally of Judah against the Big Four. After Judah died, he quit the railroad. Let's see. And he ended up in San Diego. What he did there, I don't know. He just kind of disappeared. The Big Four, fascinating stuff. You guys know those programs they have on TV, like Entertainment Tonight and all these gossip programs? Well, the Big Four would have been on gossip programs. I will tell you, Charles Crocker, he was a banker, Wells Fargo, Crocker Bank, Southern Pacific Railroad. He built the Southern Pacific Railroad. Well, he also, he was kind of a drag, and I'll get to him in a second. He's famous for his spite fence, which I'll show you in a second. Stanford is a soap opera. He was a senator from California, as we know, president of the Central Pacific Railroad. He founded the Stanford University in honor of his son, who died in youth. He also, by the way, bought the land for the Stanford University from a descendant of the Stephen Townsend Murphy Party. They had lots of land. His wife, there's a book coming out about her, and the book is, her name is Jane Stanford. While she was in the Bay Area, she was sick, and they discovered she was poisoned with strychnine. Her maid, who had some experience in that area, I don't know how you have experience with strychnine, but it had something to do with it in previous to working for Jane Stanford, was investigated and so on, found innocent, and nothing ever happened with the strychnine. Jane Stanford, subsequent to that, went to Hawaii and was again poisoned with strychnine and died, and they never found out who did it. There's a book coming out in the near future, which maybe is going to answer the question, who killed Mrs. Leland Stanford? So a lot of soap opera stuff. Collis Huntington, anybody who was in the Navy. If you were in the Navy for any period of time, you most likely went through Virginia Beach, Newport News, Norfolk, in that area. Well, he was a guy who pretty much started and encouraged the Newport News Naval Yard. So he was a big deal in there. Big philanthropist, art collector, very generous with bribes. Okay, so they hated him, but he was a philanthropist. Okay, that did all this work for the naval yards, the shipyards, but they hated him. So interesting dichotomy of people. Mark Hopkins is kind of the weirdest one. He was the treasurer. I love this quote. He could squeeze 106 cents out of every dollar. Well, his inheritance is kind of interesting when he died. He died, I had to write this down, it was so confusing. He died in 1878. During the midst of his construction of his mansion, which we'll get to in a second. After he died, he had no will. Of course, nobody has wills when you're worth bazillions, I guess. And so he his wife ended up marrying the construction supervisor. She was 22 years older than him. So in 1877, 9 years after he died, she married the construction supervisor. After she married the construction, or subsequent to that, she wrote this: the omission to provide in this will for my adopted son, Timothy Hopkins, she had an adoption son, they adopted a son, Timothy Hopkins, is intentional and not occasioned by accident or mistake. In other words, they cut him out of the will, her new husband, and she cut him out of the will. She died. The adoptive son wasn't going to take this. He sued the new husband, Edward. He got several million, quote unquote, to buy him off, so to speak, just kind of see you later, buddy. They were rumored during the trial, when actually Mary had died, he had a new girlfriend who was living there. And Timothy, after the case was over, Timothy blackmailed him to get his dollars too. So he blackmailed him because he had somebody living there. So a lot of drama. They'd be on the news at 7. They'd be on 7 o'clock programs that have all that celebrity stuff, I'm sure. Their homes are fascinating. This is Leland Stanford, and Mark Hopkins' house is right back here. He's building it right behind him. These guys didn't build small houses. They're monster houses. The interesting thing is the hotel where Mark Hopkins, top of the mark is right behind this. And when when they had the earthquake in 1906, both these houses were destroyed and burned. There is still remaining from the construction of these two houses, a retaining wall that went between them at the Mark Hopkins Hotel. So that's still there. Crocker is on Nob Hill. This is they call it a spike fence. This is a fence. Inside this is a house. He had a neighbor behind him and he wanted to buy the neighbor's property because he wanted to complete the corner. I guess he had a corner, he wanted to complete the lot. The neighbor said no. So he said, okay, I'm just going to build this fence right around your house and cut the sun out, which he did. And that went on for a long time. People came up and looked. It was it was famous. He was not exactly voted man of the year for doing this, but his spike fence was there for quite a while. After the owner of that house died, the subsequent children or ancestors of that guy, relatives, sold it to Charlie Crocker, and he took the spike fence down. His house too was destroyed in the earthquake and fire. Collis Huntington lived in New York City. He bought most of the city block. That's probably not there, and I'm sure there's a hotel there now. That was his house. Again, these things must have been dark and just creepy. And Mark Hopkins looks like a Gothic cathedral almost. And that was his house, and that now is where the hotel is there, and where the retaining wall is between this house and where Leland Stanford's house used to be. So there must have been profit in railroads. I would say so. There must have been profit. Okay, so what happened to the Chinese? The Chinese went everywhere. Bennetville, by the way, that was one of the questions I asked. The question was, what was the question? Theodore Judah had nothing to do with, he had nothing to do with Bennetville. Pardon me. He had nothing to do with Bennetville. Benneville's a mining town outside Yosemite, great hike. It's about 2 miles off the road, but he had nothing to do with Bennetville. Chinese workers did go there because of they could do mining and so on. I'll skip these three guys for a second. It's an old tent frame in the Nevada desert used by a railroad worker. And there's a monument to the Chinese railroad workers in New Jersey. They literally went everywhere all over the country. Now these three guys, I actually looked up the pronunciations of their name. This is Jing Wei, Wak Fok, and Li Xiao. This is at the 50th anniversary in Promontory Point University. So this is 1919, and they found these guys who were assumed to be ex-railroad workers in retirement. They had a railroad pension. They lived in Susanville, and they brought them back. The gentleman on the end, they're sort of like they're escorts, I suppose. So these guys must have been really old. They're probably pushing 80s, I would imagine. So they brought these guys back. I always wonder when you look at those faces, what is going on here? Anyway, so they hardly even know any names of any workers. There were no records. So the fact they have these three names is a positive. And they also went, they built the Niles Canyon Railway in the Bay Area. There's a monument in San Luis Obispo. This is in Santa Clarita. See the railroad back there. So they went every place. Even when this happened, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's a shame, I think, of our country. That's not a political statement. That's just a statement of fact to me that the last guy who comes here gets it. So when the Chinese came, they were a threat to everybody who had already been here, and probably because they worked hard and did well. These guys worked so hard, they made a profit out of digging out of mining tailings. In other words, the dirt that the miners threw out of the tunnels, they went through and got more and made money doing that. Worked hard, did well, and we can't have that for our immigrants. So people started getting jealous and so on. And they started a lot of violence, history of some massacres and so on. That was 1882 when it passed. And it was not unanimous. The president vetoed it once. Stanford was for getting rid of the Chinese, then he was against getting rid of the Chinese. So it was kind of a controversial thing. I don't think anybody became heroes out of it. There were no profiles in courage on this thing. Here's an interesting newspaper ad. This is 1943 in the middle of World War II. This is a ad, the Friends of China, I think it says Friends of China. They repealed the Exclusion Act in 1843, and one of the logical, or not one of the exercises they did into the arguments they had was, hey, the Chinese are fighting for us, with us, against the Japanese. How can we kick them out of the country? So the law that basically didn't let the Chinese become citizens and didn't let them immigrate was repealed in 1943. Of course, in the meantime, just like every other group, they were getting here anyway. They were just lived in the shadows. They lived in the shadows. Okay, so what can we see today? Now, everybody that I'm talking to can see Bloomer's Cut. It's in Auburn. It's the end of a suburb. It's walk 200 yards, and it's exactly as it looked in the 1860s, except there's vegetation now. This is it now. You can walk right down here, and you can get on the track itself. That's by the way, the track now has concrete down here instead of wood ties. It's the end of Herdall Drive in Auburn. Easy walk, well worth seeing. This is one of the few trains that only has one track and only goes one way because it's so historic. They just have to go this way. The difficult part about this was sort of, has been seen to be sort of a Chinese tryout. They had basically this long hill that's put together by, held together by some strange conglomeration, almost like concrete, with the rock and the gravel and everything else. And was just very difficult to get to. And they hired 500 Chinese, and their job was to get this tunnel dug. And they did. And that was sort of the start, one of the starts of the Chinese. And you can see it has not eroded. It's still there. It has not eroded or anything. Interesting place to go, easy to get to. I have directions in the summary that comes out next week. This is Chinatown in Sacramento. When you drive up I-5 and look to your right and see this Asian looking building, well, this is the courtyard of it. Neat place down there. It's what's left of Chinatown. And it's very cool in the summer. Nice place, interesting place to walk around. Nobody's there either. Okay, the Secret Town Trestle. If you ever watch a Star Trek movie, those of you who are Star Trek people, and in Star Trek, one of the latest movies, the last movie, Mr. Spock, 300 years old, is talking to Mr. Spock, 30 years old. And he's talking to himself from the future to the past, and it's more than my brain can handle. I can't wrap my head around it. It gives me a headache. Well, the Secret Town Trestle, I'm wondering why I brought that up, almost does that to me. When I started researching for this class, some things I knew and some things I didn't. So I started doing the railroad, and I came across this. I said, wow, where the heck is that? Well, that's in Secret Town. Secret Town is up the road. It's not much past Weimar. It's not very far. It's up the road, and I wanted to go see it. So I did some more research, and then I discovered it's not there anymore. I didn't quite understand it. So I went back and looked at this picture, and I thought, wow. I sort of figured, well, they're building it. Look at all these carts and stuff. They're not building this bridge. They are, folks, they are burying this bridge. These workers are burying this bridge. And I read that, and I thought, you out of your mind, whoever said that. See if I can show you close up. If you look at these guys, it's just one horse, one guy dumping dirt here. And notice, we'll get to why in a second. Notice the angle of this fill. If you take this angle up, I'm not an engineer, so this may be oversimplified, it almost gets right to the top of this. It's angled, be right at the top of this, and on the other side, they're also filling. You can see over here, it's gonna go down that way too. Now, the question is, why in the heck are they burying the bridge? Which is what they did. Well, you can see a couple of things. Go back to this, you look right there, you see drums, barrels. These are barrels full of water. And this is a wooden bridge. And the trains at this point, this is the late 1870s now. The trains burn wood. So what happens when you burn wood, you get sparks and you burn the bridge down. So that's what the water barrels are for. So that's what's there. But then the other, so that's one of the reasons they're going to get rid of this thing. But then you realize, why didn't they just build another one? Well, you can't build another one because that's where it goes. So here's the interesting part, I thought. If you don't believe me, there's an engineering friend of mine who might even be in the audience today who didn't believe me, and I didn't believe it either when I first read about it, but look, I'll prove it to you. Count these cross pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is when it's done. You can see there's nothing going on here anymore. Everything, they filled this canyon in with fill, put the trestle across it, and you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's go back. Count. 1, 2, 3, 4. They've already replaced one level of it. So they're basically bringing it all the way up to here and all the way down there. So you get to have this. This is the Secret Town Trestle. And the Secrettown trestle is underneath. This is the tracks on top. The Secrettown trestle is underneath the tracks. Now, I still can't quite get my head around that. 55 miles away at the Secrettown off-ramp. This is the away from the highway side, basically. This is when you go to see it, and actually you can't see it, you look at it, you drive along here and you see the angle of the fill. Tracks are up there. You can hear the freeway. The freeway is over here too. The freeway was built on it also. So you got the tracks, you got the road you're going to be on over here if you go see it. You got the tracks, you've got the fill, and down here you've got the freeway. So, and again, I put down here, Secrettown trestle today. You make it easy or as hard as you want. It is one strange place to sit there and stare at, to realize you're standing on a trestle, probably rotted, probably gone, but it was there. And I started reading about this, and apparently this is not uncommon. What they normally did was bring railroad cars full of dirt and just dump it through the railroad and just fill it up from the bottom up. But I guess they couldn't do that. So Secrettown trestle, my favorite place that you can't see. Cape Horn. This is Southern Pacific postcard. This is, I told they had to sort of dig out a ledge, which they did. This is how it looks now. This is from the Stevens Trail, which is a trail on Highway 80. And you can also see it from the Red Frog Bar on Highway 74. I couldn't, 174. We were doing pandemic, so I couldn't get into Red Frog Bar, but it's one of the places I'm going to go to see it. What I'm waiting for is somebody in this audience or some audience to tell me, here's how you get to go to it. I heard one guy tell me he almost killed himself crawling under bushes and everything else to get there. There's got to be a way the locals know how to get up to Cape Horn. Nobody's told me yet. If you want to figure that out and tell me, you'll probably get an A in this class. Pecos Golf Course, we already did. You can also get married there. You can get married there. You can discuss how these greens are part of the start of the Sierra. And you can run cross country meets there, but you can go at 3645 Fulton Avenue. You can also play golf. You can also read this. This is what it says. After the railroad guy said it was corruption and graft, this says, First Transcontinental Railroad, western base of the Sierra Nevada. On January 12, 1864, Abraham Lincoln decreed that the western base of the Sierra Nevada began where the Central Pacific Railroad crossed Arcade Creek. The hardships of railroad construction to the mountains resulted in increased government subsidies that gave the company impetus to finish the Transcontinental Railroad. Sure. Okay, so that's where it begins. Next time you bring some friends flying to visit you in Sacramento and want to go to the mountains, take them to the golf course. Old Town Sacramento, obviously easy to get to. This is Theodore Judah's monument next to the subway. Not a subway, the subway. Get yourself a sandwich. It used to be in front of the depot. They moved it in 1930. It's been around for a while. This is a big Ford building where they hung out and did their stuff. And this is mile 0 of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was a site of one of the most embarrassing moments that I can recall lately. And I've been around a while, so I've had a few embarrassing moments. 2 years ago, we had just moved to Sacramento, and my daughter, who lives here, was going to show us some stuff. So she took us to a ceremony in Old Town Sacramento that was right about here, right about where the tracks were. And it was to basically talk about the anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. And they had a Theodore Judah's one of his great nephew, whatever it was. He was kind of walking around being a reenactor of Theodore Judah. And they asked the most interesting question that I was so stunned when they got the answer. The MC said, raise your hand if you are a descendant of a Chinese railroad worker. And all these hands went up. And I was embarrassed to say that I thought, oh, I had no idea these guys were even here. Now, I'm supposed to know about history. I felt stupid, and I was stupid. And I think a lot of us would I think with the Chinese, they just kind of, as one lady said in that video, they just kind of went away. We just sort of forgot about them. But they were here, they stayed here. And that's who gave me the video, by the way, a descendant of one of the railroad workers. Okay, we're going to learn one thing today, if nothing else. We're going to call the Summit Tunnel Tunnel 6. That's what it is. It's called. That's why the 6 is big. Okay. This is the winter entrance to Tunnel 6. It looks like the entrance to a frozen hell. And in wintertime it is. It's freezing cold in there. It's got ice. Don't go in there. You can see people have. You can see where the footprints or where the walking path was. And you can get in there. There's a rail or a gate you're going to see that you can walk right around and walk through, which is what you'll be doing over here. The gate is there because I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. Somebody drove in before there was a gate and kept driving and driving, went all the way through the tunnels, ended up on the railroad tracks that were live. And that didn't go over big. Halfway through the tunnel and above it, you will see this. This is what this is. They started digging from this end. They dug from this end, and they dug from the top down so they could have basically, and put one each way, so they would have 4 faces to dig. It's about 1,700 feet. It took them 15 months. I happened to look up. I looked up how long it takes to dig tunnels now. And they have these high-speed drills. And they said they can go 100 meters a day. Okay, 100 meters a day. This tunnel is about 400 meters long. 4 days. Took them 15 months. You don't believe me, when they rerouted the tunnel, now they have when they rerouted the tracks, they're right under Mount Judah. And they dug that out through granite. So what a difference 150 or 175 years makes. This, by the way, has a nice parking lot by it and a paved asphalt walkway right to it. It used to be hard to get to. You had to kind of stumble around. Now it's pretty easy. Okay. The summit then and now. When the railroad in the late 1860s on, this is 1880, this is what it looked like here. The railroad had a lot of stuff. They had a hotel right here. They had snow sheds, about 35 to 40 miles of snow sheds all the way down the tracks. And these buildings were linked to the snow sheds. So you leave this building, you go in a snow shed. The train would stop and pick up passengers from the snow shed, and these people walk out in the snow sheds and move on. So this is the snow shed that leads toward Tunnel 6. This is the parking lot that leads towards Tunnel 6, where you're going to park, by the way, which we'll get to in a second. And this is the gate I talked about and the entrance. Do not, I'll say you again, go in the wintertime, okay? And this is my contribution to the 60s. They put up a parking lot. I think that was Joni Mitchell, I think, who said that. So that's why they put up a parking lot. It used to be that. It used to be that. And visiting the tunnels, this is my last time I'm going to badger you about this. This is Donner Ski Ranch parking right where I showed you before. Just that parking is that. Okay. When you go up there, because I know you all will, here's the tunnel you walk in, and you're going to walk all the way through these tunnels straight. And you're going to get to Tunnel 8, and you're going to see all the sites along here. Immigrant Trail, the subway, which we'll get to next week, the underpass, excuse me, the China Wall, all that stuff. The next tunnel, you'll see it all. You park over here, it's flat as a board, there's no climbing around, it's easy, you're in, you're out. Be sure to bring a coat and bring a flashlight and bring some batteries. I did dark once, you don't want to do it in the dark. It's really kind of a downer, you don't want to do it in the dark. So the tunnels are easy, just park up there. Catfish Lake, you've seen that already. What I would say is I'm in my summary I'm going to send home. It has a website. It's too hard to explain it. It's basically you're off the Immigrant Trail, or excuse me, off the Pacific Crest Trail. It's not very hard. You just got to get there. I really think, you know, that movie last week that we saw about the Donner Party, they should have had a thing in there where they threw the people in and this 12-foot tall catfish came out and ate them. That's the creepiest thing I've ever seen. I guess if you're a fisherman, it's great stuff. To me, it's just creepy. Oh, and by the way, this has been debunked. There's some story now about some settler after the Chinese did the catfish. Who knows? And really, it's okay. They were there once, and it was a fact at least once, if not twice. Before it was Donner Ski Ranch parking lot, it was this. Remember this? And this arrow points to a roundhouse. These things, when you drive in the parking lot, there's my truck right there. So I'm in the parking lot. That's the foundation of the roundhouse. So it's kind of a minor historic thing, but you can wow your friends, okay? I looked for this for 6 months. This is in downtown Sacramento, driving around, and I finally realized going down J Street, which is a one-way street, you can't see it unless you get out because you're going this way. So I stopped and got out, and there it is. This is 11th and J. This is the Chinese, the Transcontinental Railroad wall mural done in 5419, almost coming up on 2 years ago. Neat thing, just another small thing you can see. Books, if you want to read, fantastic book. Every time I read it, I almost get emotional at the end. It's just amazing what the Chinese did and what happened to them. That's kind of part. They just sort of disappeared. Great book though. Stephen Ambrose, nothing like it in the world. another excellent book. He talks about both sides of the railroad, the CP, Central Pacific, and the UP. And by the way, he had a great quote. If you remember, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I talked about trouble with the Indians. They were starting to have difficulty in the Nevada desert and so on. He talks about the difficulties that the Union Pacific had in the prairie with the prairie tribes out there, the Indians out there. And he said, I can't exactly find it, but I remember reading it. The people making the California branch of the railroad had no problems with Indians because there were no Indians left. So that was in the 1860s, and the problem started in the 1830s. So you can imagine it was a bad scene, something to research for some time. Somebody who wants to do that. 3 good books. There's another trail guide. Marshall Fay, by the way, was one of the people who didn't belong. He's a trail guru. This guy, 90 years old, still walking the trails. Great book, excellent book. Different slant on the trail guide that I showed a couple weeks ago. 2 great books that I stole tons of stuff from. A guy named Bill Udegeest. He works for or is a member of the Donner Summit Historic Society, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. 2 good books. If you want to walk around up there or just read about it. Walking Through on the Left, Extraordinary Crossings, because Donner Summit is all about crossing. Donner Pass is all about crossing. And finally this. Now this is for high achievers only. Okay, I have to move my picture of Lori here so I can see. Make sure to read this so I got it right. Both the railroad, and this is the map here, I'll show you in a second, both of the railroad and the highway. Both the Interstate 80 and the railroad travel from Donner Pass, Donner Summit area, down the mountains on either side of Donner Lake to the town of Truckee. Highway goes here. Truckee's there. Railroad goes here. It's around right here. These went down, it cuts across this now. And that was the route when they invented it. All the way down, goes back way out here, Coldstream Canyon, the Great Horseshoe, and come to Truckee. The interstate route is clearly the simpler route, straight down the side of the mountain. You can work on your tent at the beach down here and watch the cars. It has no side canyons, it has no tunnels, and it's shorter. All this being true, why did Theodore Judah choose Donner Pass as his route down the mountain and into Truckee? Again, this is straight, reasonably flat grade, wasn't a bad grade. And the railroad goes this way. It just goes around and around and around. And Judah picked this. Around, comes way around here. All the way around there. You can make a bridge right there, back here, and they end up in Truckee, not very far away, because the highway's there and the depot's somewhere in there. So this is on your summary. The question again, if you have any interesting answers to that, you can email them to me. I will say in the class last semester, nobody even attempted the answer. I expect better from you guys. And next week, roads, and roads. And a lot of roads: Dog Valley, Dutch Flat, Donner Lake Toll Road, Victory Highway, Lincoln Highway, Highway 40, Interstate 80, and the big road in the sky, and the biggest road of all. And we'll talk about those next week. And we went a little long today, but I appreciate you folks hanging in there. And I think we are